Thanks, Russ. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to participate in this conversation. I'm joined today by Danny Ortega and Raquel Centeno. Unfortunately, Raquel's colleague, Christian Gross, was unfortunately detained last minute and is not going to be able to join us. But Raquel's going to carry the torch and present their research. By way of introduction, Raquel is a PhD student in poli-sci at the University of Southern California. And Danny is both an attorney and the board chair of the National Council of La Raza, and is a dear friend and someone I've had the privilege of working with for many years. So as Russell mentioned, we're going to talk about Raquel and Christian's new research, the demobilizing effect of primary electoral institutions on voters of color. And Raquel, I'm eager for you to kind of summarize and present this research. Let me just read a sentence here from the introduction of the paper to get the conversation going. It says, are electoral institutions, such as closed primaries, associated with reduced levels of participation by people of color? We theorize and find that primary electoral institutions that bar independent voters from participating in first round elections mechanically reduce participation in primary elections and also reduce turnout among registered independents in general elections. When I read that, my mind exploded, because Danny's been talking about this for years, and this was kind of the first piece of actual academic research that I'd come across, that I'd ever seen, that made the link between closed primaries and lower turnout in the general election. So how did you and Christian and your team at USC, how did you decide to tackle this question? And tell us briefly, what did you discover?
Yeah, thanks, John, for the kind words about our research. So we took a look at independents and primary types because we were interested in just how different forms of primary institutions affect voting behavior, like whether someone shows up to vote or not. And we're interested in race and ethnicity here because there's a lot of work that exists on primaries and how they impact voter turnout, but they don't necessarily disaggregate by race, which is to say that they just look at voters in general and they don't look for disproportionate effects by race and ethnicity. So it's also important to note that Asian American and Latino voters are the groups with the highest number of independent voters, just like in terms of independent voter registration. So it's really important to think about how these things impact these groups, because it can tell us, are there huge swaths of voters that are getting, cut out of elections and not having their voices heard? So we do find that independent voters don't vote in closed primaries, and that's not surprising, right? Because that's how they're supposed to work. But right, voting is a habit, right? It's something that people kind of get used to. If you vote one time, you're more likely to vote again. So if you don't vote in a primary election, you're much less likely to vote in the general election. And we already know that there's an undermobilization of Latino and Asian American voters out there. And this phenomenon with independents might just exacerbate this problem. So in the end, to sum it up, closed primary states do lead to lower turnout for independents in general, right? But then because independent voters are mostly Asian American and Latino, that means especially low turnout for these groups. It just exacerbates pre-existing gaps in voter turnout by race.
Got it. So it's a problem among all independent voters, but it has a particular impact among Latino and Asian American independent voters.
Yeah, it's to say that, we already know that there are gaps in participation across different racial and ethnic groups in general, but because so many Latino and Asian American voters tend to register as independents, just that trend means that it hits them, it's kind of a double whammy,
Got it.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, your report is really great and it's very accessible, and I really want to encourage everyone to, take a half an hour and really read it cover to cover. There's some great graphs in it. What I was hoping, Raquel, is there's 5 graphs that really tell the story. And I actually wanted to put them up on screen and have you narrate these. So Russ, can you bring up the graphs from the report? Okay, so what do we have here?
Yeah, so you can kind of see that this is a bar graph showing, it says at the very top, registered independent voters within each racial and ethnic group. And essentially what that means is that this just shows the rates of voters that register as independents among African Americans, non-Hispanic whites, Asian Americans, and Latino voters. We pull
And
our
these are specific to the closed primary states. Am I reading that
yes,
correctly?
yeah, and
Okay,
closed primary
got it.
states. Yeah, so it's to say, because we are interested in whether closed primaries have a particular impact on these groups, it's to say, let's just take a look at what an independent looks like in these places. And as you can see here, while Black and white voters tend to register as independents at similar rates, you actually see much higher rates of registration as independents among Asian American and Latino voters. So Asian Americans are about 24% of the time registering as independents, and Latinos are registering as independents about 27% of the time.
Wow.
And it's also, I really want to underscore here, that's not the survey just asking people, do you think of yourself as an independent, right? Because some people do, but then register with a party anyways. This is actually, the survey that was conducted when it asked people that, do you identify as an independent? And then they double checked it with the voter records. So we have
Okay.
a certain level of confidence here that these are actually what independent voters look like. These are people who outright could not vote in a closed primary election state.
Got it. It's registration status. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So, I think that would be the information to pull from that one.
Okay. So this next one is primary turnout from independents based on the different primary types. So walk us through this.
Yeah, this is definitely a little bit more complicated one. So I would describe this as a probability plot with confidence intervals to show rates of turnout in primary elections across, we have all the states here. So whether the purple means that's a closed primary state, the green means an open or semi-closed, and yellow is top two. We use a variety of variables to predict whether someone will turn out to vote, and that's just a yes or no, right? Whether someone turns in their ballot or not. And we have an extensive statistical model that controls for various demographic factors that we know impact voting, like income, education, those sorts of things. So we can have a relative level of confidence here that what's making the difference is their racial and ethnic identity. And the fighter jet looking things are confidence intervals. So basically, if they overlap, we can be pretty confident there's not really anything there. But if they're not smushed together, it means that they're significantly different from each other. So we can kind of tell that something is going on there if they're not overlapping. Like if you look at white voters here, they're not together. So that means we're seeing different effects across these different primary types. And these, what we communicate here on the x-axis, so that bottom line is just the percentage likelihood of voter turnout. So that's just the predicted probability of whether someone will turn out to vote. And this is a graph just looking at independents. And as expected, very low turnout for closed primaries because that's how they work.
And Raquel, just to clarify, this is turnout in the general election?
This is just in the primary election. So this is primary turnout. So we start with that just to get a baseline of, what are the patterns here? For example, if you look at, say, Latino voters, right? There's not a ton of differences in primary turnout between open and semi-closed and top two primaries, but closed primaries, we see much lower turnout as expected because independent voters cannot vote in a closed primary. But when we move to the next figure, which is very similar, but kind of builds on this, this is everyone all together separated by party in primary elections. So what you see here is that there is lower turnout in general for independents than Democrats and Republicans. So if you look at the x-axis, you can kind of see that, for Democrats, it can go up to 60% likelihood of turning out to vote. For independents, you're topping out at maybe like 25% or so, depending on the group. But what we do see is lots of overlapping intervals for Democrats and Republicans, but not independents, right? And what that tells us is that closed primaries don't make much of a difference for partisans, but they do for independents. And even the primary type in general, whether it's open or semi-closed or top two, seems to do a lot materially for independents. It tends to have a stronger effect on independents' likelihood to turn out to vote. So having an open and top two primary leads to higher turnout for independents than closed primaries is kind of the takeaway from this stage where we're just looking at primary elections.
Got it. So let me just see if I can repeat this back to you. So if you're a registered Democrat or Republican, whether your state is an open primary, a closed primary, or a nonpartisan top two primary, your voting in the general election tends to be about the same.
So this is just looking at
Or
the primary elections.
at the primary, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but
But
yes.
if you're an independent, that's where the different primary types really have an impact on your participation.
Yeah, and we can have a relative level of confidence about that because you see that there are these differences. So they do make a difference for everybody, right? Like having an open primary is good for turnout in general. You can see that in general for all of these different graphs here, the green one is all the way over compared to like the purple ones. And that means there's just a higher likelihood of turnout. But really you see the biggest effects when you look at independence.
Got it. Okay. All right. Next slide.
So here it's kind of the same situation and we're looking at independents only, but now we're looking at general elections. So in a lot of ways, this is what I think the most important part of the paper is. It's
Right.
to say like, we know that obviously independents will not turn out to vote in closed primary elections because those are the rules, but this problem carries over into general elections as well, where they should be able to vote and we want them to vote. So there's a higher turnout than before, as we see here, based on the percentages. Here we're going up to just past 50% for some groups of voters. But what we see is that closed primaries, so the purple intervals here, are bad for everyone's turnout. But then they're especially bad for non-white independent voters. So if you look at white voters, for example, the closed primaries are associated with something like a little over 25% turnout. But for Asian Americans, that goes down to, somewhere around 9 to 14%. So there are some, statistically significant differences in how closed primaries impact these different groups. But then, I guess on a better note, a happier note, we see the biggest boosts in turnout with open primaries in the green. So you can see there are these large differences for Black voters, for Latino voters, for Asian American voters. And even when top two primaries don't make a huge difference for Latinos, open primaries do. So it's to say, if closed primaries are not great for turnout for Latinos, for example, we do have a tool to kind of help that in open primaries. And remember too, I really want to drive home that most independents, according to the data that we're working from, are Latino and Asian American. So this means that large portions of Latino and Asian American communities are not being mobilized in the general elections here and just not showing up to vote. And that adds to the cycle of under-mobilization for Latinos. So if we get an election where maybe a lot of people who are running in races, candidates, parties feel like, not sure if we can count on Latino independents to turn out to vote, this kind of confirms some of those theories that maybe are or not true. And that leads to independent Latinos, for example, not being mobilized in future races, candidates not knocking on their doors, them not getting papers, because there's only so many resources that can be allocated, right?
Sure.
And, it kind of makes some candidates potentially feel like, we're going to focus on other demographics potentially.
Got it.
Yeah, so I would say that's a takeaway from this particular.
That's like the main point. Okay. Is there one more slide here, Russ? Okay.
Yeah. So once again, we see here that this is everybody all together in the general election: independents, Democrats, Republicans, by primary type, and race and ethnicity of the voter. And once again, what we see is that this is not just about race or party for Democrats and Republicans, but the effect of being an independent voter of color. So since we're interested in Latinos and Asian Americans today, it's also important to remember this means that a lot of those voters are not being mobilized to vote, and because of that, not having their voice heard in elections. And that's really problematic, right, for our democracy, especially when we want to focus on having the needs of these communities met.
Right.
So yeah, and I would say maybe a big takeaway from our paper, at least what we took away from it, is that this is a really big problem, but one easy way to fix these problems is to move from a restrictive primary type, like a closed primary, to a less restrictive type, like open primaries. So, while we can't prove causality here, just because of the nature of the type of data we're working with, we can't say for certain X causes Y here. We can say there are really strong associations between closed primaries and lower voter turnout for Asian American and Latino voters.
Got it.
So yeah, it's important to note that, obviously moving to open primaries will not fix everything that's impacting Latino or Asian American voters.
Right. It's not the only factor that drives lower turnout, but it's a significant factor.
Exactly. It's to say that there will still be turnout gaps, but this is a great component of a holistic set of initiatives to increase turnout of Asian American and Latino voters. Right. And it just shows, how it's important to understand how primary institutions, parties, and things like polarization are understood by voters of color, because clearly there are different effects of these different phenomenon on different groups of voters out there.
Great.
Yeah.
I want to bring Danny into the conversation. Danny's actually been talking about this for years, about what this looks like in the Latino community in Arizona in particular. And before I ask you a question, Danny, I actually want to play a clip from a video of a speech you made 5 years ago that talks about this topic as a way to get things going. So Russ, can you roll the video?
To vote. At the end of the day, it is my belief that unless we vote in primaries, we don't get invested in the process. Que al cabo es que ya los que ganaron la primaria van a ganar de todos modos. And it's true. 90% of all the candidates who win in primaries are already elected. It makes no sense for you to even go out to vote. There are maybe 4 or 5 districts out of 30 in the state of Arizona, 4 or 5 districts in which you could make a difference if you got out to vote. All the other ones, 25 to 26 of them, it doesn't matter. If you didn't vote in the primary, your choice is already made. And that's why our voter turnout is low. So it's kind of pushes against each other. One, no puedo votar because I have to ask for a ballot. Mucha batalla. Come around to the general, who am I going to vote for? They're already chosen. In our districts, let me tell you something. In Latino districts, we have some of the finest politicians that we could elect. Okay? We really do. But at the end of the day, on the primary, our politicians, Latinos, stop working. Why? Because they've been elected. They don't have to get you out in the general. And when they don't have to get you out, and nobody contacts you, and nobody talks to you because they have already won, guess what? We don't get out to vote.
I'm so glad we filmed that, Danny. That's such a powerful speech. So Danny, you've been talking about this, about the relationship between closed primaries and lower turnout in the Latino community long before there was research. What did you see that brought you to this conclusion many years ago?
Well, I've been involved in campaigns at different levels here in Arizona, from being the chair of gubernatorial campaigns to the House of Representatives to school boards, congressional, and I'll talk a little bit about a congressional where we dealt with this issue in a very real way. And it's just the whole idea that we begin with, that if you register people to vote, your job is done. And that's absolutely unequivocally not true.
Right.
There's a bunch of processes and a lot of things that have to happen before we can energize, particularly in the Latino community, people to get out to vote. And I want to just come fast forward real quick and then go back. Back when I started this, or talking about this, or getting involved in campaigns, which was over 50 years ago, and I'm aging myself, I know. We were primarily registered as Democrats. And even in that situation, voter suppression at its best was active. Today, the majority of those registering to vote, millennials, are registering as independents. And so the call for open primaries is even greater now than it has been 25 years ago, simply because of that shift on voter registration. I was just commenting to you that when I registered to vote, if you didn't register for the Democratic Party, you were basically a sellout, right? I mean,
right.
Especially in my activist days, Republicans represented everything that we weren't. Okay, and so it was very difficult to think other than to register Democrat, which I still am. Okay, but I think that at some point we figured out everybody's blaming Latinos in Arizona for not winning elections because they just don't get out to vote. So we commissioned a $25,000 study 25 years ago. Okay, that's a lot of money to figure it out, look at it in different ways. We got this answer back. Nobody talks to me.
Right.
I'm registered to vote, but nobody calls me. Nobody comes to my door. Nobody gives me mail. I mean, nobody shows me some love. So that, or informs me about anything. It gives me the basis for getting out to vote. So the campaigns, the research, just the basic assumptions about why, and trying to deflect criticism. Because when a gubernatorial candidate who you're supporting comes to you after the election and he loses or she loses, the first thing they say is, I lost because the Latino vote didn't get out.
Right.
Okay. And when you take that very harsh criticism and you look at it in general, you find that the reason why our community doesn't get out to vote, first of all, is because there's no contact with them, even if they're registered to vote. And now more so, when they're registering independent, nobody wants to even talk to them. It doesn't matter what color they are. Okay. And so we never get into a groove here where we feel like we're part of a process and part of a system, and where we're keeping informed and where people are staying in contact with us. You know, the only thing that I can point to that's solvable now is the issue of open primaries. Of course, I go around the state, very, very vocal, especially to Latino politicians, and I tell them, you're the biggest voter suppressors in town. And we're talking about voter suppression. They say, why? Why are you criticizing us? It's because you only contact those who vote. They don't need you to get them out. It's those who are not voting that you need to get out. And of course, their response is always, I've only got so much money. And so I think that there's just a lot of reasons, John, most of which we can't cover here today, about why Latinos don't get out the vote. But I'm glad to see that Raquel's research at least proves something that I've seen on the ground and that I've experienced about why Latino voters don't get out the vote in generals. The primary reason, which I mentioned in the video, is decisions are already made. 90% of all local politics is decided in a primary. And in Arizona, by the way, for those of you who don't know, you can go to the poll if you're an independent and ask for either a Republican or Democratic ballot. And then, like many people tell me, hey, look, I didn't register independent to pick a party. I registered independent to pick a candidate. And if all the choice I have is to pick a party, and forget it, I'm not getting out. So that's where we're at right now, John.
It's so fascinating too, because when you think about it logically, and what you're saying about 90% of the races, once the primary is over, the general election is a done deal. If you're not contacted during the primary period, the chances of you being contacted during the general election period are very, very slim, because there's no competitive election going on. Even if there's a couple of high-level statewide campaigns going, it's not built on a culture of communication and engagement. It's built on talk to the primary voters during the primary, and then the general election, you don't need to campaign.
As a little bit of background for those of you who, all of you may be familiar with this, but I want to make sure that we're talking through the same lens. Politicians go to their parties or their consultants and ask, tell me where the frequent voters are.
Right.
Because that's all the money I'm going to spend on people who I know are going to vote. That leaves a great majority of people out of the equation, which is why people complain, I'm never contacted. Why should I vote? So in Arizona, and I don't know about the rest of the states, keep in mind, you got to be critical of candidates. All candidates, irrespective of race, irrespective of gender. You're not going to get people out to vote if the only people you're talking to are those who vote all the time.
Right.
Okay. And here in Arizona, it's very typical. And particularly within the Latino community and those who represent Latinos, which sometimes are African Americans, sometimes are also Anglos. In the general, they're the biggest cheerleaders on the stages of those running in general elections and do the least damn amount of work. Why? Because they've been elected.
Right.
I call them political cheerleaders. Okay, they're not get out the voters. They're there just for show. Because most of them want to preserve their money for the next election, not for the general. They raise tons of money.
Right.
And never spend it on the community.
That's so interesting. Danny, I want to ask you one more question and then open it up for audience questions. And give me your honest answer here. All right.
I'll try not to.
So it seems, based on what Raquel and her colleagues, Christian, have presented, that you could make a case that closed primaries should be considered, and you even said this in your video, it should be considered a form of voter suppression, and that the civil rights community, which is spending, as they should, hundreds of millions of dollars challenging other forms of voter suppression, but are not paying any attention to closed primaries, that civil rights and voting rights community should really incorporate closed primaries into what they're fighting up against. But do you think that's a mistake? Do you think that possibly this issue of closed primaries should not be seen as a question of voter suppression or dealt with distinctly, or is it part of the same mix? Or how would you think about that, both kind of philosophically and also tactically?
Well, the bottom line is that we don't consider closed primaries voter suppression. That's the problem.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that it is a form of voter suppression. Look, voter suppression comes in many sizes and colors, and we just don't have the manpower or the money to deal with them all. What's the number one voter suppressor of all? Voter registration. Okay.
Say more. What do you mean? Just the fact that there is voter registration?
Voter registration in the beginning was used to suppress immigrant voters.
Right.
In the beginning, voter registration because of immigrants. Even if they were citizens, they had to prove they were citizens. They had to register to vote, yada, yada, yada. It's like a poll tax. I mean, I could go on and on, okay, with voter registration being a form of voter suppression.
Interesting.
Closed primaries. Oh, wait, let me stop. Redistricting leads to voter suppression because of the politics involved in redistricting. Closed primaries. I mean, it just goes on and on. So we have to pick, it seems to me, the most obvious of all to increase that, because we're not going to get rid of voter registration. I mean, we're just not. We just got to work with it. Okay. And so the next step is to open up primaries so those who don't vote can vote more often, so they can get what? They can get contacted, so that people will start paying attention to them. So closed primaries to me are key here in a way that all the other things politically and practically are not going to get done away with.
Got it.
This one we can do, and different states are doing it. You got open primaries, preference voting is another one. And so I think right now the closed primary campaign, or the open primary campaign against closed primaries, has to be our number one target. And then once we do that, we move on to the others.
Got it. All right, I want to open it up for questions. Our first question is from Francis McCarrigan, and this is both for you, Raquel, and for you, Danny. A question about why people are registering as independents. So go ahead, Francis, ask your question.
Yes, we were told today that most Latins and Asian register as independents. Why do they do that? Why have they elected not to check off Democratic or Republican? Is it the word independent that they find appealing, the word?
Yeah, I can start off by speaking to that. Thanks for the question. I think it's a really great one, and I think very important to the study of politics in general. Maybe I should start by clarifying, I wouldn't say that most Latinos or Asian Americans register as independents. What I will say is that in the data that we looked at and in general, independents tend to be more generally a lot of Asian American Latinos. So as to say that there are like a lot of Latino Democrats, for example, but a lot of the independents that are out there are Asian American or Latino. As for why, there's a lot of different reasons why these groups in particular register as independents. There's some research out there that shows that part of it has to do with a lot of party politics kind of relying on your parents and your extended family to kind of socialize you to, identify with one party or another. So it's like when someone says, well, I'm a Democrat because my parents were Democrats and their parents were Democrats. If your parents are recent immigrants to the US, they were not necessarily brought up in that same system. And so the children of these immigrants may be less likely to have that strong of an attachment to American political parties. And, I think Danny put very eloquently already, all the things that go into certain groups kind of taking maybe some like some party officials or some candidates kind of relying on certain racial groups of voters to turn out at consistent rates. So it maybe leads to less contact of these groups. But even beyond that, it can also have to do with, there are very cohesive agendas at times in some places, depending on where you are, on what makes it into the discussion around party politics, right? Like what a Democrat or Republican means in your city and your state, et cetera. And sometimes, some people in these groups might feel like those agendas don't really speak to the things that they care about. Obviously these groups are not a monolith. Obviously there are big differences between maybe like Mexican Americans in Los Angeles versus, Cuban Americans in, say, Miami. But to say that in general, a lot of these groups might not necessarily feel like their priority concerns are well folded into the parties in their area. So those are just a few of the reasons that we've kind of seen in recent research as to why these groups register as independents.
Francis, I think that if you look at the study that Raquel was involved in, that's the next big question that hasn't been studied. Much like this issue surrounding open primaries that they put in that particular one that we're talking about here today. That's the question of the day. Why Latinos are registering independent? And all I can tell you is that there's tremendous disillusion among our community as it relates to Republicans. And likewise, there's disillusion, not as much as with the Republicans, but there's disillusion with Democrats. And it's this bickering that's going on between these parties and not getting anything done, okay? Particularly as it relates to our community, and it particularly as it relates to immigrants. Remember, we're in mixed households, okay? And
Right.
we're in mixed families when it comes to those of us born here in the United States and those of us who are immigrants. And when you look at the plight of the immigrant community, particularly in Arizona, the incubator of the most anti-immigrant legislation in all of the country, I can speak to Arizona and tell you that the disillusionment with both parties is high. Number one. And number two, I go back to my original analysis. Even if you register Democrat, you got to vote 3 times before anybody contacts you.
Wow.
Okay. And so it's kind of like it feeds on itself. It feeds on itself.
Thanks, both of you. We have a question from Nancy Arduengo in Delaware about what kind of outreach to independents has shown to have an impact. Nancy, you want to ask your question?
Yes. So I just wondered, what kind of outreach has actually been shown to make a difference in those particular populations. I know people like to be contacted, but then some people don't really want to be contacted. They kind of want to make up their own mind. So what really works? What outreach works?
Can I jump on that real quick to give an example?
Yeah.
I was a chairman of a congressional campaign over 20 years ago. Okay. And we had a very high profile, worthy opponent who was out of Tucson, and the mayor out of Tucson. And of course, the person here out of Phoenix, Arizona was also highly qualified former supervisor, the Maricopa County supervisors that were running against each other. So it was Phoenix against Tucson, which is a classic, right? And we figured, how can we really make a difference? And we were still somewhat progressive, and we were still not as practical, and we wanted to try new things, okay? So we decided that we would mobilize a team of close to 200 people that would only contact registered voters who hadn't voted, okay? We won by 1,500 votes. All right, I mean, if that doesn't tell you anything, see, this is why I'm so hot about this issue, that if people, if they would reach out to people, people would respond. And we found that the increase in voters who hadn't voted or who recently registered to vote went up in that particular election. Why? Because we paid attention, because we talked to them, because they got a mailer, because somebody came to their door. I mean, somebody called them, any one of those, not all of them together. I mean, it's pretty expensive to do, but had we not made that commitment to that community, and that was really a kind of a liberal thought, we gotta contact voters who aren't voting, blah, blah, blah. Let's build a culture of voting, and this is the way to do it. You know, most candidates would say, look, dude, I'm here to win, not to build no culture.
Right, right.
And we did both, and that's why we won.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
A question for you, Raquel, from Carl Rubenstein about the difference between open primaries and top two primaries. Carl, go ahead, ask your question. You there, Carl?
Yeah, I had to
Oh,
unmute.
okay, great.
Okay. And with the notion of open primaries, my perception is that mathematically, if you're a smart party, you can manipulate things by minimizing the number of candidates that you've got in order to have a greater percentage of the votes going to your party. Wouldn't that work better with a ranked choice voting system?
Yeah, I can speak on this definitely. So, I mean, you're right that, right, like local parties make a big difference in, or they have strategies in how they want to approach primary campaigns, especially depending on the strength of the party in the area, depending on how close they anticipate an election to be. These are all things they think about, right, in terms of like party recruitment, who they see as viable candidates versus non-viable candidates, who they want to provide resources to upon the primary. These are all things that people think about, especially in like, say, your state Senate election or your House of Representatives election for your state. I would say that there are a lot of different ways to approach kind of the decisions that are made in that way. I think ranked choice voting is definitely one way to kind of adjust maybe the calculations they make when they're thinking about primaries. Another one I'm pretty familiar with is approval voting. So that would be, you know, rather than ranking candidates in order, like 1 through 9 or what have you, approval voting would involve just asking voters to select all the candidates they approve of. And these all make a difference in how votes are tallied in the end. And I think that you would be right to say that more than likely having these types of systems in effect in an area, so say combining like an approval voting primary with open primaries, would likely change how local parties would approach these elections. I think that that would be a really interesting area too for some future research. So I think that's a really great question. Thank you.
Interesting. I want to go back to Arizona here for a minute. We have a question from Sarah Smallhouse, who I know is actively leading a public education campaign to repeal the closed primary or the semi-closed primary in Arizona. So Sarah, go ahead with your question.
Well, I didn't really have a question. I just was thanking you for organizing this call, and I've been listening to Mr. Ortega very carefully, because in Arizona, if we're going to be successful, this is likely going to be a constitutional reform by citizens initiative, which is a very heavy lift indeed.
Right.
So we need to get the moderate partisans and all the independents and PNDs, no matter who they are or where they live, in order to be successful. And we don't have an unlimited budget. It is a concern, but I think we have to do things in a different way if we're going to be successful. This is our third attempt at instituting open primaries in Arizona, and we are critically aware of that. So I'm listening to all the advice and wisdom carefully.
Well, I'm glad you're on the case. Okay, a question from Victor in Maryland about the opposition to open primaries. Go ahead, Victor. You can unmute yourself. And
I thank you for putting this call together. I've been following your efforts for years. And to be honest, I'm very frustrated that we haven't gotten more traction. And so I'm tired of working with friends. I want to work with enemies.
okay.
I want to know which groups oppose open primaries the most. Who do you have the biggest problems with? Thank you.
John, I think that one's yours.
All right, I'll take a stab at that one. You know, Victor, I could give you a simplistic answer, which is the parties. The parties tend to be the biggest opponents to open primaries, but that's not quite a satisfactory answer because there's a lot of cracks and a lot of fissures within both parties. Some of our biggest spokespeople, like Danny is a leader in the Democratic Party. We have Republican spokespeople. We have people within the parties that recognize that the closed primary system is very harmful to their own party, not to mention the broader body politic. So it's hard to point a finger at just, one bad guy. It's not a monolith. The opposition tends to be those people, Democrats and Republicans, and their assorted interest groups and donors, the kind of ecosystem surrounding the people that are in power, that got elected in the current system, that want to get reelected year after year. They want to do business in a way that's predictable and they know things. And when you go from a closed to an open system, those people feel threatened. I feel, our ballot measure in Florida, for example, in 2020, which we got 57% of the vote and lost because you need 60% in Florida. On the day that we were certified by the Secretary of State, meaning we're on the ballot, the voters are going to get to vote. On that day, we were sued by the Democratic Party of Florida and the Republican Party of Florida, two completely different lawsuits. And that's because both parties, they have their habits. But at the same time, some of our strongest advocates that were leading the campaign were Democrats and Republicans, as well as independents. So it's not a monolith. And I think, to your frustration about the lack of, traction or the difficulty of this, I'm not telling this to convince you, but I take enormous inspiration from the abolitionists and the civil rights movement and the folks that spent centuries working to engage some of the fundamental unfairness in America, and how brutally frustrating that was to go decade after decade with what seemed like little progress, but then things change very quickly. So I actually see a huge amount of traction and progress from when we launched open primaries in 2014. But, I wish we could take care of this by next Thursday. So somewhere in between next Thursday and 100 years, I hope we can make some progress. Anything to add, Raquel or Danny?
I would add that the other factor is that big money has too much invested in this two-party system.
Yeah.
Big money. I mean, I remember, 16 years ago, a U.S. Senate campaign in Arizona would cost $20 million. The last two senators that were elected in Arizona raised over $100 million from all sources.
Wow.
And so when the Supreme Court came down with Citizens United, where they considered, who could contribute and who couldn't, and gave that opportunity to corporations, that's where right now look, money has never gotten in the way of progressive politics. Money has never gotten in the way of change, whichever direction you want to go. But today, more than ever, it is the factor when you look at the spending that goes on by billionaires who can drop 100 million like I can drop $10, right? And so money and too much invested in the two-party system.
All right, we have a number of other questions here. June from California has a question about people changing their voter registration. Go ahead, June.
Yeah, I was wondering if you considered as part of the study how close to the primary people can change their registration, and if that had an effect, because it seems to me the compromise position, rather than opening the primaries to everyone anywhere at any time, is that people be allowed to decide preliminary to the primary which party is putting up some reasonable candidates and that they'd like to be able to choose between, and then register into that party close to the election, and then go back to being independent afterwards if they want. And so I was just wondering if you had considered that in your study. I happen to be of the opinion that parties should mean something. I don't think they do as far as the Democrats and Republicans anymore, but that's why I don't like the idea of generally opening everything. For example, in some states, one party, or in some districts at least, one party is so dominant that the other major party doesn't even run a candidate.
Right.
And you know what the outcome is going to be. That means that people from the dominant party can register into a small party to try and defeat the best candidate from the small party. I don't like that idea. So I'm just wondering if you considered things like that as parameters of your study.
John, Arizona is as close as you're going to come to what you're suggesting, June. You can register as an independent and show up at the polls on election day and choose a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot. Okay, that has shown not to increase voter registration. Okay, it just hasn't, because independents aren't doing, like I said earlier, independents are not registering as independents simply because they don't like the party. They simply want a choice as to who they can vote for, not what party to vote for. And so, but look, Jude, I'm not at all against taking small steps, right? Undoubtedly, it hasn't worked here the way they thought it was going to work. And maybe now it's time to go a step further. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day. I think we need to try a lot of things and take small steps, but taking them as soon as possible on Thursday, even starting Thursday, okay, is really, really important. So exploring all those possibilities are all small steps to bigger change. And hopefully we can also take into account, and I can see most of you fall within my age group, that things do change over time. We just have to work hard and be patient.
Raquel, does your data, did you guys get into any of that minutia in terms of this kind of state rules around party swapping?
Yeah, we did actually. So when we made choices about where to sort states in our data into different buckets, we actually used a set of, call it coding, but basically categorizations that were established by my colleague Christian Gross and another co-author of his or two. And they basically kind of took a hard look when they did that particular paper at all the rules of all the different states and really thought hard about, what does it mean to be a truly open primary state?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be such a closed state? Because obviously there's kind of a gradient among a lot of these,
Yeah.
already touched on, there are like various minute differences across states. So in this particular paper where we used the data that they came up with, we actually did include open and semi-closed states together. So it's to say open states being ones that are, as you and Danny have described, right, where there aren't really any rules, everybody gets a ballot with everybody on the ballot. Whereas a semi-closed would also include ones where independents cannot necessarily have like their own ballot. Not everybody receives the same ballot, but you could, within a few days of the election, within a reasonable amount of effort, gain access to a ballot of some kind on the day of the election, or walk in and ask for a ballot. Like they can vote in some way, as opposed to closed states being where an independent truly has no viable path to voting in a closed primary. So that was kind of the decision we made in this paper.
I want to bring in Sandra Cosgrove because from Nevada, she had a question that was related to this. Sandra, do you want to add anything more to this line of questioning here?
So we just in Nevada implemented automatic voter registration, which defaults people to the nonpartisan status if they don't pick a party, and same day voter registration and voter registration update. And we are now doing universal mail-in ballot. So we're really going to be watching in the month of May as nonpartisans. And I teach at a community college. I can tell you my students, they affirmatively register nonpartisan because they care about issues, not the parties. And we're very Vegas. They want a buffet. They want to step into that buffet and pick their candidates and not be told what to choose. But we're going to be watching to see as the nonpartisans get their mail-in ballot and realize top of tickets are not on that ballot, to see whether if they then go over and pick a party. Because if they don't, that's going to affirm what Danny just said. They are nonpartisans. Right. That's the way they want to be able to participate. So we're gonna have some good evidence for you, Raquel, real soon.
When is that, Sandra? When is that election taking place?
So people should start getting their mail-in ballots within the next 7 days. And then our primary is on June 14th. So we have a full 10 days of early voting. So about middle of May to middle of June, we'll be able to watch the voter registration numbers to see how people line up.
That's fascinating. That'll be really interesting to take a look at. I wanted to go to Harry Kresge in New York, who had a question for both you, Raquel and Danny, about the motivations behind some of these efforts. Go ahead, Harry.
Hi, great discussion. I was struck by Danny's emphasis on mobilization. And I take it, at least what I heard is in a local race in a Latino community, let's say, there's an incentive for people to mobilize Latino voters in order to win the primary. But then once those candidates and those organizers win the primary, they lose interest in the general election, because if you win the primary, you're not going to really have any strong opposition in the general election. But doesn't that suggest that that there's a parochialism on the part of the mobilizers of the Latino community in those localities, that they don't have their eyes on the general election as well? Because obviously they could have a big impact if they could deliver the vote. So I'm just trying to get a sense of how all of this adds up.
Don, let me respond to that by saying that the biggest problem that I have with the folks who win in primaries, and that's the majority of Latinos who are elected to office win in primaries. The criticism that I have is that they become cheerleaders for those running for governor or those running for statewide office, if it's a presidential year, for president, okay? But they invest no money, $0, in getting that vote out again and telling people how meaningful it is beyond the primary to vote in the general. And so it's a combination of, A, 90% of the decisions have been made already. Why do I go out to vote? Second, nobody contacts me after the primary. All I do is hear speeches from politicians, right? And they're not talking to me, they're talking to somebody else. So it's a kind of like, it builds on itself, Harry. And to me, at the end of the day, either somebody's spending money to get voters out, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. And if you don't spend money to get voters out, they're not going to come out. Every gubernatorial candidate, every U.S. Senate candidate, every presidential candidate who hasn't spent money in the Latino community sees the same result. Why? Because they keep doing the same thing. They go to fish to where the fish are at, and that's the most frequent voters.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think, I think Danny put it very well. It is, and in political science, there's a lot of research on this under mobilization of like Latino candidates or Latino voters, which is to say that, as Danny put it, years and years of not being contacted do add up. Right. And there's almost sort of this confirmation bias where, when candidates or people who are doing mobilizing see that maybe a certain set of Latino voters in a community don't show up to vote, they say, oh, it's maybe because they don't have an interest in voting. Like, we put up a few flyers and we did a few mailers and it didn't work out. What ends up happening is this cycle continues for a long time. And, I already kind of touched on this idea earlier, but voting is a habit, right?
Right.
And if you don't vote one time, you don't necessarily have it ingrained in you to look out for the next election, because for a lot of voters, they're not necessarily like counting down the days to the election, right? They need a little bit of reminders. They need some more information, and especially in local races where it can be hard to find that information, you really rely on the local mobilization community and the local candidates to really inform people of what's going on in the race. And if you don't reach out to them, then they won't show up to vote. And that's just kind of how it works.
One example that I gave was, remember when we were in grade school and high school and we wanted to get perfect attendance? It feeds on itself. You also want a perfect record of voting, right? So until you feel like you want to do a perfect attendance, the same thing with voting. I don't want to not vote in an election because I want to keep my record clean as voting all the time.
Got it. We have a question from Min Thu Pham about what other organizations have been reached out to around this. Go ahead, Min.
Hi, everyone. Min Thu Pham. I'm with New American Voices, and I mobilize Asian American voters. Thank you so much for elevating this issue. It's so important. And your analysis is spot on with what I've observed and what we've seen in the community. I wanted to ask if you've been able to get the Asian American and Latino communities behind you on this, and whether there are any groups that might be able to help elevate it and make the case.
Yeah, I can
go ahead, Raquel.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit on our research. I think there's a lot of exciting research coming out on the different voting barriers and ways to mobilize Latino and Asian American candidates. I know that there is an organization, AAPI Data, I believe, based on the West Coast. There's a lot of interesting research. So I think if everybody kind of keeps their eyes on, I don't know how many people are keeping their eye on the political science research space, but if you do, I know that there's a lot of people coming out with work on what mobilizes these voters, what these voters care about, and kind of the best ways to create voter coalitions that's coming out. I know my own dissertation, I'm looking at the different ways that different people like Latino voters look at partisan polarization. So I think you'll see a lot of interesting stuff that kind of provide insights into how to build these coalitions that you kind of speak on.
Yeah, well, I'm building those coalitions now. And I just put into the chat a legal scholar who's a good friend of mine. He's actually calling this passive voter suppression.
Interesting.
I think that's a phrase that, and so this is a piece he did. He's at Berkeley Law. And he's calling it passive voter suppression. And they actually did a study on this to show that the active voter suppression bills that are going through legislatures all over the country, not reaching out to voters actually has a worse impact than those active bills that are suppressing votes in these communities. So I'd say maybe we take up that phrase, passive voter suppression. But in terms of reaching out to those communities, I know there is a lot of research. We do it ourselves. We did in-language outreach in the 2020 election to swing voters, and it is very effective. The problem is that convincing campaigns to do it is, as Danny has mentioned, absolutely impossible. So anything you can do to elevate it, and then I'm happy to work with you to try to help get the rest of the community. I'm talking to Christine Chen, the head of API Vote, next week.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you. And I love the phrase, so I'll definitely be looking into this work. We always appreciate help getting the word out about these important issues. So it's great to hear that you're doing just that.
Thanks so much.
Just to add to that, Min, Danny and I were actually talking a number of years ago about wanting to develop like a working table of Latino leaders and organizations that were going to, start talking about this passive voter suppression that doesn't fit the kind of the mold of the legislative targeted efforts to reduce participation, but are just part of the structure. And I must say it was very humbling because so much of the money and the focus is on those targeted efforts, things like reducing mail-in voting or making it more difficult to physically vote, not these passive structures that are just that we do that. But I'm confident that we're going to get this conversation out there and we're going to broaden it, and really appreciate you being interested in helping to do that because it's so important.
I also just wrote a piece in the Washington Post. I'm just going to put it into the chat too. That's along these lines. It's about immigrant voters who are independent, and the far right has convinced them about voter fraud and the big lie. And it's actually quite unfortunate. 80% of Chinese Americans supported the Proud Boys before January 6th, the insurrection. Wow. And so you're seeing that the far right is reaching into these communities, but pro-democracy activists like yourselves on this call are not. I just put this is the link without the firewall or the paywall.
Oh, I can't wait to read that. I can't wait to read that. Thank you so much for being part of our call too. We have time for just one more question, and I have to throw it to Lily Centeno from California, a freshman in college majoring in poli-sci. A question for you, Raquel, about what inspired you to get involved. So go ahead, Lily.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering what inspired you to pursue this type of research in particular? Because I'm looking to go into research potentially for my future career, and I just want to know like your mindset and like what direction put you here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really great question. So I think I became interested in research because, I found myself really interested in asking questions about politics. And I kind of started off by being interested in questions about, what makes people want to get involved in politics? So what makes someone lean into politics instead of kind of leaning out of it? And as I kind of continued with that, I started being interested in how do people navigate their various intersecting identities? How do you balance your partisanship with your race or ethnicity, your sexuality, your gender? And so that's kind of what led me into what I do now. And I do a lot of stuff with survey research and experiments because I think you can find a lot of really cool information that way. I like to talk to people about what they think. I like to use different quantitative methods to kind of measure, what things change people's ideas, what persuades people, what makes them kind of feel a certain way. And so I think that's why a lot of the research I do is kind of focused on the psychology of how people think about politics and how they respond to the institutions that kind of govern our political structures, like primary systems. And on top of that, really focusing on research that produces solutions about politics, right? So something that can really speak to, okay, we know what really drives a particular phenomenon. Now, what can we do about it? And so I think that's what's really valuable about conversations like what we're having today is, it's taking the research that's out there and it's also connecting it to people in the community who are doing a lot of this active work, because I feel like sometimes academic research doesn't always do that. So that's what I really try to aim to do with my own research, at least. So that's kind of, I think, the mindset and how I kind of got into academic political science research.
Great. Thanks,
John,
Raquel, and
just,
thanks, Lily.
John, real
Yeah, go
quick,
ahead, Danny.
My advice to students that are interested in political science, and particularly the kind of work that Raquel is doing, I always say to them, get involved in the campaign. This just can't be about academics. Get your hands dirty. Understand how the dynamics of a campaign work, how the dynamics of a party work. Choose your side, it doesn't matter, or be independent, but get involved in the campaign, because the on the ground experience is invaluable. And then you can make assumptions the way I did without any background.
Well, that's good. That's very good advice, Danny. Thank you all. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all the questions, but we've run out of time. Thank you, Raquel and Danny. This is great. This is a really important conversation, and look forward to finding ways to expand it in the months and years to come. Just a quick plug before we go. Our next virtual discussion, myself and Jeff Bukes are going to be interviewing Jonathan Hayt. Jonathan just wrote a pretty explosive piece for The Atlantic about the relationship between run amok social media, divisive social media, and structural political reform. And I'm really looking forward to talking with him. We don't have a date yet. It's going to be end of May, early June. My co-host is going to be Jeff Bukes. Jeff is an independent and is the former CEO of Time Warner. He was, he's run a multinational media company and has some interesting insights about the current regulations overseeing the social media companies. So I think it's going to be a great discussion. And I want to ask you not only to come, but help spread the word about this conversation. I think it's a vital one about the relationship between social media and democratic structures. And I'm hoping to have hundreds of people participate in that conversation next month. So thank you all for coming. Love the conversation, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
And thank